Hello and welcome to the Conscious Finance Podcast. I'm Leo Hewett, founder of Core3 Recruitment and your host for today. So the purpose of this podcast is to inspire change, to explore ways in which finance leaders can impact business decision-making for the greater good. Often, finance departments can be tarred with a brush of only caring about top line and bottom line profit. So we're here to challenge that stereotype and hopefully prove otherwise. So welcome to episode 2 of the Conscious Finance Podcast. I'm really excited to be joined by John Collins, who is the CFO for Vivobarefoot, and they are a purpose-driven B-Corp footwear company. So a bit about John. He achieved his ACA at Deloitte and then climbed the ladder at Diageo up to commercial finance director. He then joined Pucker Herbs as their finance director before becoming the CFO over at Vivo. And interestingly, John is also a board member of Friends of the Earth, which has given him many strings to his bow beyond finance, which will be really interesting to learn a little bit more about. So John, I guess we haven't known each other too long. I feel like we've got to know each other quite well recently, just helping you find your head of finance. But I don't know a lot about your early years, I guess, and how that molded you into the person you are today.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Leo, thanks very much for having me. It's a real privilege, and it's been great working with you a lot more recently. I mean, my origin is I'm from Dublin originally. I have 3 sisters and grew up in a seaside town called Malahide, which I used to think was the center of the universe for a long, long time. And look, my childhood was very typical. My father was an accountant, which is probably why I followed this route as well. I played a lot of sport when I was younger, and if I look back at those years, I was very fortunate. Not too many ups, not too many downs. It was just a really quite idyllic upbringing. I feel very privileged to look back on it like that.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And what do you think has led you to really seeking that purpose-led way of working?
Oh, that has been quite a long journey. I mean, I was actually reflecting quite recently. I started with Deloitte 20 years ago, almost to the day, which, God, when I say that out loud, I still can't really believe it. And I think for a large part of my career, or certainly the first half of my career, I'd like to say that the choices I made were really driven by a personal purpose or the purpose of the organizations that I worked for. But I think that would be a bit disingenuous, right? So when I was in secondary school, I remember talking to a guidance counselor about, what do you like and where might that lead? And accountancy and history actually were my favorite subjects. And she kind of latched on to this and then set me on a path which has actually was very, very influential over the last 20 years. She told me about, professional qualifications, and there was a couple of degrees in some of the universities in Dublin that if I had pursued those, I'd be able to get exemptions from the first few years of exams. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. If I do this degree, I'm going to skip the first 2 years of exams to be a chartered accountant, and by the time I'm 24, it's all going to be set, right? And I don't necessarily regret that, but what I didn't have an influence or what I wasn't influenced by was somebody telling me, look, there's actually many ways to get to that route, right? So, like history was really my passion, but I think I was quite blinkered on the accountancy side. I met lots of people then subsequently who did degrees in geography and degrees in history, but ended up following the same path as me. So, but anyway, I went in and did a degree in accounting and finance in Dublin City University. And from that, I was put through the milk round with, it was the big 5 at the time. So, who was it? The company that ended up folding in 2002.
Anderson,
exactly.
That's the one, yeah.
So That was the last year I think Anderson were doing the milk round for graduates. But I did my interviews with all of the big four, the big five. Was lucky enough to get some offers, and then I ended up choosing Deloitte. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is that was just a sort of a path that there was a kind of an inevitability to it, as opposed to me thinking about, what is the purpose of Deloitte or PwC or KPMG, and that just wasn't part of my consciousness at the time. And then I did, the standard 3.5 years of a trainee contract with Deloitte, and then I was seconded to Diageo. And in Ireland, Diageo is obviously synonymous with Guinness and with Bailey's. And when I went on that secondment, I guess that was the first time I had encountered a culture that really resonated with me. So in my audit career, you're fortunate enough to go through the door of many, many organizations. And I remember thinking, as I go on new assignments, could I actually see myself here? How did people treat each other? What was it like when you walked in the door? What was the look and feel of things? And honestly, Diageo really stood out for me in terms of its culture for that. And I guess that's kind of associated with its purpose as well. I didn't know, Leo, at the time that taking on what then was a 3-month secondment was going to turn into, the next 12 years of my career. So yeah, I'd like to say those early choices were driven by purpose, but really it was just more the sort of path that was in front of me, I think.
Yeah, I noticed actually early on, I know you got to sort of commercial FD in the end, but when you first joined, you had a number of roles, and there was one that interested me even way back then. You had a job title which was compliance and ethics manager, which sounds quite unusual. What led you into that?
So when I started with Diageo, I was working in the Irish business. So that was not one of the brands, but it was the Irish business selling the entire selling and marketing the full Diageo portfolio. And the person who I was working for when I first went on my secondment, a guy called Kieran Gowing, a really influential guy in my career. He took on a new role in the global PLC head office in London, heading up the compliance and ethics function. And if you go back, this was around 2008, and so the consequence of the Enron scandal, Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, this was getting more and more on the agenda for Diageo, and so they had set up a dedicated compliance and ethics function. And he basically rang me and said, I'm building a new team. It's going to be based in London. And at my personal life at the time, I think I was definitely looking for a bit of an adventure, an opportunity to break out of Dublin. As I said, for a long time, I thought Dublin was the sort of center of the universe. And here was this amazing opportunity for me, Leo, to stick with a company that I was really enjoying working for, an opportunity to move over to London, which it's only like an hour on the flight, but London's the most vibrant capital in the world. And whilst I think compliance and ethics on paper wasn't something that I was particularly passionate about, I guess if I'm being honest, it was a bit of a means to an end. But it actually turned out to be a very rewarding part, because it gave me a real global perspective, because the function we were in was, a global function, and I was assigned responsibility for our Asia Pacific operations and some of our corporate functions. And our expansion into Asia Pacific back then meant we were going into less mature markets, where I think the risk around compliance, fraud, bribery, money laundering was much, much higher than I would have been used to working, say, in the Irish business or the UK business or some of our European businesses. And so what I thought wasn't going to be a particularly interesting role ended up being fascinating. I mean, on a personal level, I got to see a lot of Asia, which for a person sort of, 27, 28 was just amazing to sort of land in these, foreign climes where the look and the smell was completely different to anything I experienced before. But also I was exposed to some pretty real compliance issues around some of our business units that I just wouldn't have got if I'd stayed maybe in some of our more mature markets. And then I think the other part of it was I got in that role, I got to see the perspective of the global PLC, which was very, very different to say just the Irish business, where you take on, you'd literally take on a much more global perspective. So I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it much more than I actually thought I was going to.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good grounding from the different roles that you had there. And then what was it then that sort of led you on to Pucker?
Well, there was a couple of steps between the compliance and ethics role and Pucker, and I'll run through them quickly. So, having had the opportunity to leave Ireland with Diageo facilitating that, I thought, wow, this is, what other adventures could I avail of by being part of this amazing organization? And I very distinctly let it be known to anyone who cared to listen that if there was any assignments in far-flung places that, maybe other people weren't interested in, I really had an itch to see the world. And I remember saying, I literally wanted to step outside of my comfort zone. Like, I wanted to go somewhere where, kind of what I got a taste of in the Asia Pacific region when I sort of land in New Delhi for like a week. I wanted to basically live and work in an environment like that. And then amazingly, an opportunity came up to move to East Africa in Tanzania, where Diageo had just acquired a beer business in Tanzania. And so they needed to pull together a team to both lead the integration of that business into Diageo, but also establish some of the basic functions. And so I ended up moving to Dar es Salaam in the summer of 2010. And that was the most profound personal experience. The lady who's now my wife, Michelle, she also came with me. We met in London about a year previous to that. And yeah, the two of us we were at a life stage where we didn't know we were going to commit ourselves to each other at that stage, but we had no other commitment. So I said, do you want to come on this adventure? And she was like, yeah, let's do it. And it was amazing, Leo. Like, we landed in Dar es Salaam, and it was just wonderful. Like, it was the most visceral sort of experience, and it really felt more alive than I ever had been in my life up until that point. And I could talk forever about that experience in Tanzania, but I think from a professional point of view, working in that environment, it was the first time where I had a real sort of general remit. So, my previous roles had been roles of depth, but not necessarily a lot of breadth. And in an environment like, a new acquisition where, you're under-resourced, you're trying to run the business at the same time as integrated, you might have a job title, but the expectation is you do whatever needs to be done. And that's when I got a real flavor for a more generalist role where I could really get my arms around everything. And so I think that was a really formative part of the types of roles that I was looking for going forward. And then when the Tanzania chapter came to an end, I then took a bit of a sideways route in Diageo. So Diageo has a really interesting subsidiary called Justerini and Brooks, which is a fine wine merchant based in the centre of London. Completely different business model to, premium beverage alcohol business that Diageo had. This was a company that was 400 years old, had a royal warrant since the beginning of royal warrants being issued, real heritage. And essentially we had relationships with, the fine wine producers of the world, and an amazing, portfolio of private clients who had worked with Justerini's, in some cases like family generations.
Wow.
And so a completely different business model, but the role that I went for was finance and operations director. And I was there for 2 years. And I think in that 2 years, I accrued a breadth of experience that maybe would have taken me 5 or 6 years otherwise. Like I had responsibility for logistics, supply chain, there was strategy, there was all aspects of finance, there was treasury. We had some subsidiaries that we needed to divest. We had new partnerships that we wanted to form. And so whilst it wasn't the biggest P&L in the Diageo sort of portfolio of business units, and it wasn't the sexiest of areas in the Diageo sort of realm, I came away from that again. I think I got probably 3 times the experience that I would have done elsewhere. And then after that, Leo, I took another weird step. So through the work I did with Justerini and Brooks, we reported into the UK Diageo business, and from that role, the head of the UK business then asked me if I'd be interested in moving from finance into commercial, and I sort of took a double take a few times, saying, "Are you sure you're talking to the right John? Like I'm the finance guy." Yeah. And he had this new strategy, and there was a role of field sales director for the UK that he was very interested in me applying for. And so I kind of felt the fear and did it anyway, Leo, and ended up, heading up the field sales function of Diageo, 220 people, hardened salesmen and women. And here's John, who'd never sold anything in his life.
I did not know that. That's amazing.
Yeah. The imposter syndrome sort of was on a scale that I've never experienced before. And that was amazing. Like I joked about the imposter syndrome, but for the first few months, I really struggled with, having the self-belief that, having the same level of belief in myself that others had in me. And I remember my boss saying to me, because it was really beginning to affect my ability to do my job, actually. And he said, "Look, John, you're here for a reason. You're not here because of your sales experience. You're here because we need to set a new vision. There's new leadership. We believe that you can do that." And I think that gave me the kick in the backside that I needed, Leo, to sort of get over myself and just really embrace the opportunity. And that was, from an Irish point of view, I was responsible for Guinness quality in the UK, which was a great honour and privilege for me. But it also led to untold abuse from my friends at home whenever they come over from Dublin and give out to me about why the Guinness in London was so bad. And it literally was my responsibility, so I didn't have anywhere to hide. And so, again, I guess that role, Leo, was again in service of my desire to have as broad a remit as possible. And I thought, I didn't really know if I was going to continue on that commercial path, but I thought, if I do go back to my finance roots, well, spending 2 years in a senior commercial role can only help my credibility if I go back to becoming, going back to a finance path. Yeah. And I took one more step in Diageo, whereby I became commercial director in our travel retail business for Europe, which was a relatively short-lived experience. Again, I learned a huge amount. Brand new channel, brand new it had a much bigger brand marketing side to it. But that proved to be my last role with Diageo. So there was a restructure in the business, and my wife and I, at that time, had decided to relocate to the southwest of the UK. We were beginning to prioritize family a bit more than everything else. And so I just thought that the time was right. I wasn't in a position to follow the Diageo path wherever that needed to be. And I also felt I was sort of coming to the end of the road with Diageo. And so I took redundancy after 11 years, and it coincided with the birth of my first child. So it was this amazing sort of break at a really important part of my life.
Amazing. I would never have guessed any of that looking at your background on LinkedIn. I just had a quick scan of the different roles you had, and you just make assumptions, don't you? And you just assume, okay, big business, Diageo, straight out of the big four. You just assume, really good grounding in FMCG, big corporates, probably quite structured and, rigid in certain ways. But I would never have guessed that you've been all around the world and involved in new acquisitions and wearing many hats beyond finance during that time. So what great exposure you had quite early on. That's amazing.
Well, I that's some indirect feedback that I need to market myself a bit better, Leo. No, look, I'm really fortunate that organizations like Diageo, and I've moved away from those huge global PLCs, but they can facilitate some of the most profound personal development and life experiences, and I'm really grateful for that. And I think there was a lovely, I was sort of looking for adventure in my entire life, and I was just in the right place at the right time to avail of those opportunities, and I don't regret any of it. It was amazing, an amazing time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can vouch for that. I think I've come from a big business background, globally listed, albeit recruitment business, and I would agree. You're just surrounded by amazing people, aren't you? And I think the training and the development that you get in those organisations is second to none. So I think that's definitely been something I've benefited from, and then the opportunities that you get along the way. So then, what led you to Pucker?
Yeah, I mean, this is where definitely my path and how I sort of what informs my decisions really changed. Like there was up to that point, and so I'd taken redundancy and obviously had a bit of time to think, really, for the first time. It's a real privilege to be able to do that, and I do recognize how fortunate I was to really think about, well, like what now that I've got the choice, what do I actually want to do? And there was a lot happening on the personal side that also really influenced these decisions. So my wife and I had been trying to start a family for a long time, and as I have subsequently learned, a lot of people find that path not as linear as they may have wished to. And we went through quite a difficult process emotionally and physically, and my wife had quite a serious health scare off the back of some IVF treatment that ultimately wasn't successful. And all of this was happening around that time of the Diageo, us moving to the Southwest and the restructure and all of that. So it was quite how do I say, there was a lot going on, basically. And so when I had left Diageo, I'd just been through that fairly difficult period, and my wife and I had also thought we were in a place where having children ourselves wasn't actually going to be something that was going to happen for us. And for anyone who comes to that conclusion, that's quite a difficult thing to get your head around. But we were living in Bath, and we had heard about this herbal practitioner in Bath who basically like a general doctor would see patients for a whole array of things. But we had heard that he'd actually had some success around helping couples with their fertility. And we went to see him. Really interesting guy, kind of Svengali, like long black hair, in this kind of quirky clinic in a building in Bath, and spoke to him. He did up some herbal concoctions for my wife and I. Also gave us some very sound advice, sort of for between the ears. And
okay.
Amazingly, 3 months later, my wife was pregnant. And
amazing.
It truly was. Like, I don't know what you put in those potions, Leo, but
incredible.
It worked. And why is that relevant to this conversation? Well, the guy I went to see was a guy called Sebastian Pohl, and I subsequently found out after going to see him that he is the founder or the co-founder of Pucker Herbs. And 3 months after that, a person who a former colleague of yours in the Southwest recruitment business, gave me a call to say that there was this interim finance director role for a herbal tea company near Bristol. And I said to him, "It's not Pucker Herbs by any chance?" And it was. And I thought, wow, this is pretty extraordinary. And so I think this was the first time where I had, just from the very facts that I've just shared with you, I then saw this organization that was built on a purpose. And Sebastian's whole reason for founding Pucker was he understood the power of herbs. He understood the power of herbs, that they could play in the role of humans' lives, our individuals. But he also saw the power of organic herbs harvested in the right way, the benefit of that for the planet as well, versus, say, conventional agriculture. And so he set up the business he said the best way to get more herbs into people's lives and to promote the cultivation of organic wild herbs throughout the world was to basically put them in a tea bag, make them taste great, and just get them out there. And so here is somebody who, in a very profound way, had a lived experience of the power of herbs. I credit that to the fact that I am now a father, and so I was lucky enough to get the role, and I didn't sort of overplay that aspect in the interview process, because you need to get there on merits, not because of some other reason. But then that was the first time I truly understood what working in a purpose-led organization meant, and for myself, I understood the power when you personally are deeply aligned to that purpose. Like suddenly work was no longer work, or it was I used to think that work was something that kind of had to be done. It was like a necessary, and if you could enjoy it, great, but if you were enjoying it too much, you probably weren't working hard enough. Like that's sort of my probably my Irish Catholic background. And so I found myself in this environment where I was going, this is amazing. Like I was pinching myself saying, this is too good to be true. And then I think circumstantially within Pucca as well, the timing was really important, because they had just been acquired by Unilever. And Unilever was really keen for Pucca not to lose its independence. But they also, we were now part of a global PLC, a global FMCG PLC that had the same, requirements and reputational risk and stakeholder expectations that, like, say, a Diageo had. And so I found myself in this great situation where I felt I could understand the world of Unilever. I was profoundly connected to the world of Pucca, and there was a job that needed to be done to bring those together. And so, like, I really feel it was a case of right place at the right time, and it was just a perfect for me, really.
Yeah, that is one of my favourite stories of how somebody ended up in a business. Talk about fate. That's unreal. I bet you had to pinch yourself when you got that phone call.
I did. I like, and I still do to a degree. And I could look back on many different moments where if I had made a different decision, maybe we wouldn't have gone to see Sebastian, or I wouldn't have made the connection with Nick, your former colleague, or or if we didn't move back to Bath, but who knows, right? But I definitely, I think there's something going on there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So then, I guess beyond Pucca, what was it that made you sort of then move on to Vivobarefoot?
Well, I think I think one of the interesting things in Pucca for me was the finance team, where what I call a very traditional finance team, so heavily orientated towards financial control, sort of head below the parapet. It was like sort of, a mark of success for finance is when nothing goes wrong and you don't really hear from us. And that wasn't the sort of, I felt that finance has a much bigger role to play than that very stereotypical view. Like all of those things, around stewardship, reputation, our statutory obligations, all of those things are like non-negotiable, and you can never compromise on them. But for me, finance is in such a privileged position within any organization that it's almost criminal not to leverage that much more. And I mean that from the perspective of people within finance, but organizations also not really getting the most out of the finance function. And I think in Pucca, there was an expectation that no matter who you were, what role you did, in some way you would contribute to advancing our mission, and you would live your purpose. Like, it wasn't really an option to say, that's kind of their job, or that's the sustainability team job, or the marketing team. And for me, one of the areas that we were struggling with was we would talk about the impact that we wanted to make, right? So by living this purpose, by advancing this mission, we wanted to have an impact. But maybe with my finance hat on, I like to sort of tangibly get my arms around, well, what is that impact? And are we really making the impact that we think we are? Can we do it more effectively? And I think there was a huge appetite for that in the business as well. And there was also this contradiction that I found, and I think a lot of organizations have this, where in purpose-led organizations, you deeply and viscerally feel that you're doing this for more than just top line and bottom line financial growth. Mm-hmm. And yet when you actually look at how you manage performance and how you talk about performance and how you perceive performance in those organizations, it often just defaults back to the numbers, right? And I felt that there was a big missing in all of that actually finance, because we are a very respected voice, we sort of have a seat at the table by default, and we speak a language that is universal, and we report and we measure all the time. I thought, like, there's nobody better suited in the organization to basically plug this gap. And so we went on this fantastic journey of trying to define, well, what impact are we trying to make? So we know what our purpose is, or at least we thought we did. And in provoking this question about, how do we measure this and how do we evolve our definition of performance, we actually went right back to first principles in Pucka around, well, we're a purpose-led organization, but are we really aligned on what that purpose is and what it isn't? And we say we're mission-led, but are we all on the same page when it comes to what specifically that mission is? And that kicked off a process where we actually went right back to the drawing board in something that we all felt, but had never really pinned it down. And that process took much longer than I thought. But once we did, and once we had a common language around what we stood for, what we were going to do, what we weren't going to do, when we talked about impact in Pucka, what did it actually mean? Suddenly, I might almost like had my marching orders. Like, now I know what we're going to do. And so we led a process whereby we took our conventional metrics of performance and we transformed that into a far more holistic framework around everything that we're trying to do. So whether that was the well-being of the farmers in our supply chain, how we treat our employees, how much tonnage are we converting from conventional agriculture to organic agriculture? And if you do all of those things, the financial performance is going to come. And we didn't neglect the finance side of the business, but by leading with that in terms of measuring our performance, the engagement went up, and people could really make a connection now between the things that their heart was sort of behind and what that then translated into conventional numbers. And so, I think the finance team really evolved from what I had described earlier to be really right at the vanguard of of the mechanics of being in a purpose-led organization is. And I think from that point, I then realized, having, stepped away from finance and stepped back in, I think I found a real niche around, this is the power that we can unlock within finance functions in those organizations.
That's really interesting subject, I think, for any business is how can you sort of measure performance in those different areas, and something that we're working on at Core 3, and thinking about that holistic stakeholder view of not just measuring profit, but also measuring your impact on your customers, your community, the environment, your employees, and putting in sort of frameworks and ways to measure that impact. But I think what some people struggle with is how on earth do you influence the leaders at the top to sort of buy into that way of working, and where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think in Pucka, it was a bit of an open door, to be fair. Like, and I remember Sebastian really provoking me. Like I remember he used to say, John, there's some of these things don't add up, right? Like we're talking the talk and we're walking the walk, but we're not almost accounting for how we're talking the talk and walking the walk. So I think for me, in certain organizations, it's an open door, but also I think it all kind of came full circle in the end, right? Because when you talk about business as a force for good, right? The operative word in that phrase is business, right? So we, like the Puckers of this world, the Patagonias of this world, the Vivos of this world, we've chosen business to be the medium through which we live our purpose and deliver our mission, right? And like whether you like it or not, that has to be sustainable in the most conventional sense of like financially sustainable, right? So you need to hit a number, and through that P&L, you need to create leverage and value so that you can reinvest it in all those other things that you want to do. And so I think the process that we went through on Pucka, which got everyone on board then, was when it came back to the financial metrics, people just looked at it in a new light, right? So instead of just talking about gross margin expansion, we would say, well, like why are we pursuing gross margin expansion? Is it so that we can drop more profit to the bottom line and fill the pockets of Unilever shareholders? To a degree, right? But we also have an ambition to invest in the innovation within our supply chain. We also want to create the financial headroom to pay fair premiums for the raw materials that we want, because we know that paying fair premiums has a bigger impact. We want to spread the word about why drinking an organic cup of tea is better, and that's brand marketing and that's performance marketing, and that's not free, right? And so the finance, the conversation around finance becomes less of this linear sort of turnover to profit to this kind of flywheel of, we pull all the levers through that P&L, and it always comes back to us choosing to be a business as a force for good. And the more you can turn that financial flywheel, the further you can advance your mission, right? And so, that sounds very idealistic, and I'd like to think that this was some overnight thing, but with the benefit of looking back at the last 4 years and coming back to your question about how do you convince others, that for me is a really compelling argument, which is very difficult to argue with, right? Because it's the truth. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess for the non-believers out there, have you got any examples of where operating in that purpose-led way has actually then had a positive impact on revenue or profitability longer term?
Well, look, I mean, non-believers is quite a strong word. Like if I take for example Unilever, an organization that I have a huge amount of respect for, particularly in the context of like global FMCG PLCs. I mean, Unilever genuinely strive to do the right thing, and I think they acknowledge, just given the scale that they play, the scale they have in the world, the responsibility they have to try and do things right, and they definitely are on the right path. But so, for example, I guess I'd rather than call it, I call it like skepticism. Like, what is all this business as a force for good about? And again, coming back to the fact that we play in the business arena, you can hit every non-financial purpose KPI, but if you're not delivering profit and if you're not delivering growth, that is a very short conversation, right? And I think in Unilever, everyone sort of would buy into what we talked about, and they acquired the business because they understood it. But the legitimacy comes with the delivery of the financial performance, right? And I think it is very well understood now that authentically purpose-led brands have got a competitive advantage in the marketplace now. I mean, every consumer in those who have the luxury of choice, I guess, in the world, are trying to make better choices, and the credentials of the products that they buy, or the companies that own the products that they buy, are coming under more and more scrutiny, and people are voting with their feet, right? So I think it's not just this subjective emotional argument that, you know, we should all be striving and committing ourselves to organizations that are trying to do better in the world. There is a financial business case that backs that up, right? And you can see that in any number of industries, or any number of recent valuations on purpose-led organizations that have been acquired by larger businesses.
Yeah, definitely. But I think from what you said there, that the most important thing is it has to be authentic, because if it isn't, then A, you won't deliver on your promises, and B, people will see straight through that.
Very, very true. Like, it's you know, the sniff test. Like, what is the real authenticity behind that? And that'll come out in the wash, Leo. You know, I think it's very, and I've sort of experienced both sides, where I've worked in organizations that are founded on that purpose and that mission, and what you see today is still, you know, so aligned to those founding principles, to maybe brands or businesses that where maybe those founding principles were the same, but they were founded 300-400 years ago, and what you have today is just a massive brands that you're trying to perpetuate. And, you know, a lot of those brand owners recognize that, you know, it's no more, it's not good enough anymore just to, you know, have a glitzy brand. You've got to unearth the purpose that's in there, right? And that's been difficult. Like, if you look at Unilever, they've come under quite a lot of criticism, you know, around, you know, some people have accused them of spending too much time trying to retrofit a purpose to a brand like Hellman's, for example. I'm on the other side. I do think what they're doing is absolutely the right thing, but it's much harder when you're sort of working backwards. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to unwind things, isn't it? Once they're already on that momentum path.
Yeah.
So I guess going back to the litmus test that you talk about, and sort of being able to navigate around greenwashing and false claims in businesses and things like that. I've always seen B-Corp as quite a nice, almost seal of approval that a business is walking the walk when it comes to their purpose and making a real impact, whether that is social or environmental. Obviously, there have been some businesses that have let the side down in the press without naming names, but what's your view on the B Corp movement?
Oh, I applaud the B Corp movement. I think it brings legitimacy to an awful lot of organizations who maybe have a real passion to do the right thing, but sometimes don't know where to start. It also brings the legitimacy of third-party certification, and like my experience in Pucca is that's important, right? Because people can be very, very good at fooling themselves that they're doing the right thing. There's nothing like getting an independent third party in to validate what you're doing. And I think B Corp, what surprised me when I first got involved in it, so when I joined Pucca, I totally underestimated what it did for engagement of your workforce, because sometimes some people, and finance is often the case, sometimes you can see these like agendas within organizations that some certain parts of the organization don't necessarily feel fully included in them, right? And particularly like back office functions, and it's quite an old-fashioned term, whereas B Corp is so all-encompassing in every aspect of how you do business, that there's an opportunity to involve everybody in, you know, like you can lean into, say, the governance aspect of your B Corp score, and suddenly you have populations of your organization who until that point probably wouldn't be able to tell you how the work they did impacted the advancing of our mission. Whereas now you see this really tangible thing, whereas we leaned in onto the governance score, and from one year to the next, we managed to increase it by, I don't know, 5 points because we did X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. Like that's a massively galvanizing thing. And it's also an all-encompassing framework as well. So it gets the whole organization behind you, right? So there's a real internal uptick. And then
just on that as well, I remember chatting to, I can't remember who I chatted to over at Pucker, but I'm definitely going to pinch one of their ideas for sort of getting people involved in, getting the whole company involved in the B Corp journey. And I loved how they called the people who had responsibility for whatever part of it, beekeepers.
That's right. We beekeepers, and then we have a queen bee. Which,
that was it.
When I left, was an old colleague called Dave Anderson. He didn't necessarily appreciate the title, but no, like that's it. Like it's an amazing way to like shared experience. Like getting the whole organization to go through something and emerge the other side, hopefully having improved things. It's just a wonderful thing, and you'll know from the side of the table that you sit on as a talent attraction sort of lever, like more and more people are looking for B Corp organizations. And then I think fundamentally the thing I love the most about B Corp is, I think I saw on LinkedIn the other day, there's now 1,000 UK B Corps.
Yeah.
And there's a real risk that certification could become diluted. But my experience of B Corp certification is they keep on raising the bar, right? And like to the point where if you stay static, you are going to go backwards. And I think that's a testament to the B Corp movement and to B Lab. And, I think rather than looking at the fact that we now have 1,000 B Corps in the UK as B Corp becoming ubiquitous, that just means there's 1,000 organizations that are meeting a far higher standard of how we do business, and that can only be a good thing. Yeah,
I mean, I read something earlier in the week. It was an article, I think, around how COP27 is just a disappointment that we didn't really, move the dial at all on the 1.5 degree goal, and it was an article that said actually, well, we can actually make a huge impact as a small business ecosystem, and actually small businesses represent a huge majority of the overall carbon emissions that then feed into the huge global corporates that everybody targets when it comes to their ESG agenda. But actually it's their supply chain that could have a much greater impact if everybody decides to make a difference and make small, simple changes. And I think the B Corp movement is a great way to offer that North Star, if whatever you want to call it, of how to go about it. Because like you said, it provides a lot of principles, a lot of rigor, a lot of frameworks, a lot of governance, a lot of ways to really sort of set your business up in a way that will genuinely make the world a better place, hopefully. And I think if I hadn't have had that, the 250 questions that I had to go through for the B Corp pending certification, and really thinking about every single one as I'm setting up the business and as I'm implementing contracts, employee handbooks, our impact business model, whatever it might be, it's completely holistic. And if I hadn't have gone through that, then it could have easily ended up with, we give 3% of sales to charity and we put our purpose on the wall and that's it. Yep. Whereas this is just so in depth and yes, it is onerous and it is time consuming, but I think without that, then it could have been at risk of becoming just a claim. And are we really living it in every single walk of life?
I totally agree. And just to riff off something you said about the small organizations, what I find fascinating now, and this I sort of get this from my Diageo and Unilever experience. If you take Unilever, who have acquired B Corps, and they also have a independently certified, so Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream brand, is a B Corp, and Pucca obviously is a B Corp. I think they have a couple more, but they are now like these cells that have infiltrated the mothership, right?
Yeah.
And like, they are inspiring and driving. Like, one of the great things about Pucca being acquired by Unilever, there's a lot of people from a distance who would sort of look at that and say, that's not a great thing. But like, on the inside, what I observed was Unilever welcomed Pucca to really hold up a mirror internally to what the wider organization had done or was doing. And I remember Sebastian in particular, he won't mind me saying this, like, one of the great sort of ripple effects of being an organic business is the more you grow, the more, if you're replacing, say, a conventional tea brand, like at a raw material level, you are converting conventional agriculture to organic agriculture, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the holistic impact of organic agriculture versus conventional, it's just amazing for biodiversity, for the livelihoods of the people who work the land, for the quality of produce. It's just this wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. But Pucca is a drop in the ocean. Suddenly you become part of a Unilever where their agricultural tonnage that they contract every year is in the millions, right? And then suddenly you've a seat at the table saying, what are you doing about the percentage of agriculture right now, which is conventional, which is the vast majority? And I saw that over 4 years where Unilever would respond to that internal sort of, provocation. And I've just seen Diageo, Bailey's, I think, I could be mistaken, but I think I saw this on LinkedIn last week. They are now B Corp, right? And so, and I know that Ekaterra, the organization who bought Unilever's tea portfolio, which I was involved with at the end of my Pucca days, they are now aspiring to B Corp certification, and that's a €2 billion business. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Danone. Well, they went through B Corp quite a while ago, didn't they? And then I think they were the biggest global B Corp for quite some time, if not still.
Yeah, so it's happening. It's happening at a small scale. It's happening at a big scale. So all good.
Awesome. So then that leads us on to Vivo.
Yeah, and I think the Vivo opportunity. So like, why did I leave Pucca? I think is probably a good segue, and I think one of the things I learned, and I try to I share this with anyone who cares to listen, but particularly in the finance side. When I arrived at Pucca, I experienced what it's like to be in an organization where what you bring is really valued, right? And I know that's a really obvious thing to say, but as I explained, Pucca were at a certain stage in their journey, and I was looking for something, but was also bringing a body of experience. And those two things is like that Venn diagram. Those two things met in the middle, and that is, from a personal point of view, that feels great, right? To know that you're actually making a difference. And I remember, like, some of the things that I was suggesting was like stuff that I had just been brought up with through my Diageo career and Deloitte career. I didn't place much value on it, but then when you come to an organization maybe that hadn't been exposed to that before, what you think is a really easy thing to sort of give has this massive impact, and that feels great. And so what I learned at Pucca was, I was going forward, I was going to try and find that sweet spot of an organization that needed something that I was going to bring. And I know that's a really obvious thing to say, but it wasn't at the forefront of my decisions in the past. And so Pucca, I think I referenced briefly, part of the wider tea portfolio of Unilever. Unilever then sold their tea portfolio to a large private equity business called CVC. And I just felt that the role I had been playing up until that point kind of wasn't as important anymore, or wasn't needed as much. And there was definitely, that was going on a path that, there's no judgment from me. It just having been a part of large organizations before, having something sort of close and small and that I could get my arms around is sort of where I personally want to be. And so I had a chance conversation with the previous chair of Pucca, a guy called James Furrs. I hadn't spoken to him in a couple of years, and I just dropped him a message about something quite random. And he said, "Oh, listen, have you ever heard of this business, Vivobarefoot? I've just been talking to their CEO, and they're looking for a new CFO." And I actually mentioned your name, and he told me he said this the day I sent him a note, which is ridiculous. I don't know if it's the truth. Maybe he was indulging me. And so I was introduced to the founder, one of the founders, Galahad, and I must admit I was not aware of Vivo. I think maybe they were somewhere in the back of my consciousness. I think one of my team members had a pair of funny looking shoes way back when. But then I was like, my goodness, like all of those traits or the aspects of a business like truly purpose-led, founded, the founding principles where this specific mission, like there it was, legitimately manifest. And I was like, wow. I mean, and again, going back to that point around where they were at on their journey and what I thought maybe the value that I could bring, it seemed like this right time, right place, right fit between two parties. And I feel very, very fortunate to have been introduced to Galahad. And then relatively quickly, Leo, there was a process, and I started with them in July. So, I'm coming up to the conclusion of my 5th month. And it's been all I expected and probably a little bit more.
Yeah, that's another fateful move.
Yeah, well, I guess so. I guess the other side of it, though, is that whilst we'd like to think that B-Corp and organizations that genuinely stand for a purpose beyond just the bottom line, it's still a relatively small community, right?
Yeah,
and so, and a lot of people know a lot of people. And so I guess in terms of like the network, maybe it wasn't as far out there as it might sound. However, again, I honestly didn't, I had written down the attributes or the characteristics or of the organizations that, if I had the choice, this is what I'd love to be a part of. And I can say without exception that Vivo ticked all of those boxes. Lots of similarities to Pucca, but also very, very different. And even selfishly, a new industry for me and a new sort of business model and a new sort of cash cycle. So yeah, I am sort of pinching myself. I'm not gonna pretend that it's all been plain sailing in those first 5 months. I mean, it's hectic. Vivo is 10 years old, which is nothing in the lifespan of a business, and we're growing rapidly, and that comes with so much wonderful things, but it also comes with crazy growing pains that everybody sort of feels. But I wouldn't want to be anywhere else at this point.
Yeah. What was it about Vivo's purpose that drew you to it? Because I guess outside looking in, if I didn't know what I knew about Vivo, you'd think, how can a shoe company have such a purpose?
Well, I mean, so Vivo's core purpose is connecting people back to nature, and that was something I without sort of going off on one. And maybe since becoming a father as well, I think a lot of the challenges that we face in society, as individuals, as families, as organizations, can be brought back to really just this disconnect that we have with the natural world. I mean, the environments that we live in are more and more detached from nature, which is where naturally we should be. Our habits, our lifestyles, We are all just a couple of steps too far away from the planet in which we live. And I think if you look at anything around, some of the health epidemics that we have, if you look at the level of challenges that children are having in school today, if you look at the level of autism that we see, if you look at the climate crisis, everything else, I really feel that it's that at the heart of a lot of those issues. And I don't claim to be an expert or pass judgment on those things, but a lot of that is that disconnect. And in speaking to Galahad, our shoes today are a great sort of manifestation of that disconnect, right? If you look at your feet are some of the most sensitive parts of your body. Like if you've ever got a foot massage, it's a wonderful thing. It's because your feet are full of what we call proprioceptors. And, back in the day before we ever wore shoes, your feet were like a sixth sense. They would send signals back up in terms of the ground that you were walking on. And if you look at shoes today, or the shoes that I have worn all my life, there's a lot of padding between the sole of your foot and the ground, right? And so in that sense, stripping that back, I think that resonates with me. But then also, some people might be listening to that going, well, John's gone a bit native there. But if you actually look at the sustainability impact of the shoe industry, I mean, I think there's something like, I might have my facts wrong, but there are 7 billion shoes manufactured every year. And the percentage of that is recycled is negligible. Like all of that at some point is going to landfill. And I definitely believe, like, one of the reasons business as a force for good appeals to me so much is I think it's quite easy to sort of stand on the outside and point out all that's wrong. I think it's much braver to sort of be on the other side and actually change it from the inside out. And so whilst the minimalist footwear is driven by what I talked about earlier, there's also a real, like, conventional sustainability problem that we need to overcome in the industry. And one of the other things I love about Vivo, Leo, is we are not there. Like there's nobody in Vivo claiming that we've cracked the code. We are only at the beginning. And if you were to look at our annual reports, our annual report is called Unfinished Business. And like it's brutal transparency over, look, this is our aspiration, but, we are only, not even 10% of the way there. And I really admired that because, in the world of greenwashing and blah, blah, blah.
It's authentic again, isn't it? I think
it is. And I think the other thing that I've learned about is this founder legitimacy. It's only 10 years old, and Galahad and Asher, the two founders, are right at the vanguard. And to be there, like, I hope that what we're creating is, if I look at Diageo, the brands that I worked on were brands with 2, 3, some cases 400-year-old heritage. I think it's amazing that, we could be at the very start of creating something that could be really, really profound.
Yeah. Are you pursuing that idea of the circular economy at Vivo?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. So we have a thing called our V Matrix score, which basically breaks down every aspect of our value chain and evaluates the circularity of it, the sustainability of it. And we've got some very, very exciting innovation, which I genuinely can't disclose any of the detail, but it is all about fundamentally disrupting the shoe supply chain. Like this idea of you make loads of shoes in a factory far away, they get shipped, they sit in a warehouse with lead times using material that might not necessarily be sustainable. Sizes they vary a lot. People send them back. We are working on a couple of things which have the potential for like wholesale disruption of that entire business model. And that's
watch this space.
Yeah, well, exactly. Or watch these feet, I think is what I said.
Yeah. Well,
so really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been really lucky to work for some very purpose-led businesses that are certainly leading the way on environmental and social responsibility. So, what advice would you give our audience on things that perhaps they can implement tomorrow that will make a real impact as a finance department?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is this is a general statement, so forgive me, but I don't think finance teams or individuals in those teams fully appreciate the potential impact that they can have on their company's agenda, right? So the things I said before, finance has a respected seat at the table. The reporting of performance or the narrative around, like, the storytelling about how we're doing as a business, a lot of that falls in the remit of finance, albeit in quite a narrow way. So you say, this is how we're doing top line, this is how we're doing margin. And that story, needs to become a much, much bigger story. And I don't think there's anyone better placed in an organization than the finance team to start provoking that story to become much bigger than it is, but then B, play a role in telling that story, right? And so, I mean, the first thing I would say is, look at yourselves and give yourselves more credit for the potential that you can have. I think that might sound a bit woolly, but in more practical terms, B-Corp, even, and as you know, Leo, like as certification pending, regardless of the outcome, taking the B-Corp framework is a wonderful place to start when, quite often there's a huge ambition and energy to do something better, but you can waste a lot of time trying to figure out, well, where the hell do I start? Grab the B-Corp framework. There's no better place to start because it allows you to audit every aspect of your organization. And then what else would I say? No, I mean, going back to that beginning, I think I'm pretty sure that conventionally a lot of finance teams are still reporting in quite a narrow way. And one of the catalysts actually for me was I attended a conference in London about 4 years ago with a colleague of mine from Pucca. It was a net impact conference. And I guess I'd say that because expose yourself to people who are maybe a couple of steps ahead of you on this. And like all the things that I've learned in terms of evolving the finance function, I've not come up with it myself. I've basically stolen with a huge amount of pride, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it'd be great. And hopefully, this podcast can give people some inspiration just to start thinking differently. We talk about challenging the stereotype of what a finance leader or a finance function should be and should involve, and I think you've articulated that really nicely.
Yeah, it's a bugbear of mine, and I definitely am guilty of sort of perpetuating it myself. Self-deprecating humor about accountants and how does an accountant change a light bulb? How does an auditor change a light bulb? They look at last year's file. And we need to break out of that, right? Because as you know, Leo, on the recruitment side, the role of finance is light years on from that sort of old bean counter stereotype. And anyone who still believes it or anyone who still perpetuates that isn't going to be doing anyone a service. I mean, we've got a really important job to do. And as I said, like companies now also have a much better appreciation for that and are looking for that sort of talent. So I feel quite passionate about that.
It's brilliant. Well, if anyone is interested in pursuing the B-Corp journey, I can absolutely recommend one of the consultants who helped me on my journey, and he was brilliant. So if you need any guidance, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm sure John might have some pearls of wisdom if you're happy for people to reach out, John.
I'd be delighted.
Brilliant. Well, I could talk for hours, John, about this with you. I think we might have to get you back actually for a second appearance because you've got
Wow.
so many good things to say. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really eye-opening for me and plenty of food for thought. And hopefully the audience feel the same. And hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, Leo, thanks for the opportunity, and I have great admiration for what you are creating in your own organization, and I think you marry. One thing you can't compromise on is the quality of the output, and I've experienced that as well. So thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you, John. That's very kind. Speak soon.